All right, good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Michigan Gun Violence Prevention Summit. My name is Ryan Bates. I'm the Executive Director of End Gun Violence Michigan. We're a statewide coalition of faith, community, parent, teacher, and student organizations all working together to end gun violence in our state. Michigan made history last year and passed a number of critical gun safety proposals into law. The primary goal of this summit is to learn how we can use these new tools to save lives in our communities. However, those proposals were just the start. It took decades for us to get to this point where guns are the #1 cause of death for children, and it's going to take decades of effort to make that to change that horrifying reality. So we're here today to cast a vision for the future. What's next? What else do we need to accomplish at both the state and federal level to protect our communities and particularly our children from the scourge of gun violence? We're joined today by 6 critical leaders in this field. Sean Holihan is a policy expert with the Giffords Gun Violence Center, who's been a critical asset for our movement, roving the halls of our Capitol and making the case to legislators. Nick Wilson is a national expert with the Center for American Progress, help provide critical policy ideas at the start of this work. And Monisha Henley is the National Government Affairs Director for Everytown for gun safety. State Representative Kelly Breen is with us and is the chair of the Michigan House Judiciary Committee and shepherded many of these bills through that committee from great ideas into law. But we're going to start with our federal representatives here today, U.S. Representative Elissa Slotkin and Representative Debbie Dingell, who've both been longtime and vocal advocates on this issue. We'll start with Representative Slotkin. Representative, what has been happening at the federal level and what should our goals be going forward?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Great to see you. Thanks for being here. Thanks to the University of Michigan, to Johns Hopkins for putting this together, and for our Giffords friends who are always leading the way on these issues. So you've heard from a bunch of great speakers, and we'll hear for a bunch of more. I think for me, as a federal representative, I think about the issue of gun violence and gun safety as one of the sort of cornerstone examples of what it means when we have federal gridlock and what doesn't get done when we can't do our work at the federal level. Obviously, I have been deeply impacted by this issue, mostly because I happen to be the first Congresswoman in America to represent 2 school shootings, Oxford High School and Michigan State. It's sick. I actually knew how to do the second one because I had lived through the first one with the community of Oxford. And of all the things I've seen in, 3 tours in Iraq, carrying a weapon, of all the scenes of violence I've unfortunately seen in my time, I don't think anything was worse than meeting with 14-year-olds and parents who are dealing with post-traumatic stress from a school shooting, and trying to convey the lessons that I was taught coming out of a war zone for kids who were survivors of a shooting in their sanctuary. And you all know, if you're on this call, that the #1 killer of children under 21 in the United States of America is gun violence in our communities, in our schools, by suicide and by accident. So despite the fact that I grew up with guns, right? I grew up like a lot of Michiganders of shooting guns. This issue really has me by the throat, and it makes it even more infuriating that we can't get anything done or can't get substantive change like we've seen in Michigan at the federal level. So just to review the bidding on sort of where we are at the federal level, we're basically watching states like Michigan do really important, difficult work and changing things state by state across the country. And that's because despite the, just sheer number of horrific gun violence problems we have across the country in our communities and in our schools, we have not been able to get legislation, most seriously through the U.S. Senate, when it comes to gun violence and gun safety. We have passed unbelievable numbers of legislation when the Democrats ran the House through our House, along with Debbie Dingell, who's here. There's a million different ideas from people who really care about this issue, but they have not really moved in the US Senate. So just to review the bidding, after Oxford, the safe storage laws that have now passed in Michigan, we introduced an exact copy of that law at the federal level. After the MSU shooting, I introduced a bill called No Crime Left Behind that just basically said, ripped from the headlines of the MSU shooting, that if you are convicted of a gun-related misdemeanor, you should not be able to go out and buy a gun, right? Like the shooter in the Michigan State example. I think the areas where we've made some progress, which is very important, is on the issue of studying the issue of gun violence as a public health issue. During the last 5 years, we have been able to open up for the Centers for Disease Control the ability to study this issue. We can study it. But myself and Senator Markey authored a bill that funded the CDC to talk about what solutions actually work in our communities and in our schools. Okay, it's good to study it. We know we need to study public health problems in America, but what do we do about it? What are the scientifically based approaches that actually lower gun violence in our communities and in our schools? So there's no shortage of attempts. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the reason most of this legislation sits on the desk in the Senate is because, unlike almost any other legislature in the whole world, we have a requirement of 60 votes in the Senate, the filibuster rules, to allow something to come for an up or down vote. So the Michigan Senate has a 1-seat majority. The US Senate has a 1-seat majority. We can pass legislation through the Michigan Senate, but not through the US Senate. So I just want to put out there that so much of this good legislation that many of us have voted on has not gotten an up or down vote. Not to say everything would pass, but it hasn't even gotten a real up or down vote in the US Senate. And so it's just very important, among other reasons, that we do filibuster reform for the US Senate. Separately, we continue to try at the federal level. We use a tactic called discharge petitions, trying to force a vote in the House right now, since leadership isn't entertaining any gun safety bills. The most recent one was on banning high capacity magazines. So members of Congress who believe that vote should come to the floor sign a discharge petition. And if we have a certain number, it's forced to the floor. We just haven't been able to get some of our Republican colleagues to join us in that discharge petition. And then separately, we have legal proceedings going on at the federal level. I think the one I would draw your attention to, if you're not always already tracking it, is the Rahimi case that is going to the Supreme Court. It's actually at the Supreme Court right now, waiting for a decision, which we hope to get June, July-ish. Which would, I signed the amicus brief. I'm assuming maybe Representative Dingell did as well. That basically says if you have a restraining order on you based on the issue of domestic violence and abuse of a partner, you should be banned from buying a gun. That is with the Supreme Court right now, and that's a way we might actually see some federal change. Even though legislation has been difficult. It's not to say that the one piece of federal legislation that we passed hadn't done things. So just to make sure we're tracking, after Uvalde, right, that horrible shooting down in Texas, so many babies killed in Uvalde, we did pass a bill all the way through the Senate that did some important things, and most importantly, provided money to states like Michigan, right? 46 states actually, who have extreme risk protection orders, that have legislation on the book, that have a way to go and help police, local police, go after folks who are a risk to themselves or to others and remove the weapons from their homes. It's increased or improved background checks. It's done some important things, but I don't think there's anyone who feels like they're happy about where we are at the federal level. Lastly, I will just say, as someone who frankly represents a district that is very focused on their Second Amendment rights, where, in Michigan, in the center of Michigan, where people grow up, as I did, shooting guns, I think two things for a community that cares about this stuff. Number one, sometimes you can throw talking points at people and policy papers, Nothing is more impactful than getting to people's hearts. And we saw that after Michigan State University. So many alumni in the state, everybody has a cousin or a nephew or a child who was at MSU. They know that student union where the shooting happened. And I felt immediately the change in people's hearts about this issue, such that it helped support what the legislature was doing less than 10 weeks later in Lansing. I had calls from people who I know are big Second Amendment believers, and they're like, look, if you come for my guns, I'll come for you, but protect my babies in school, right? So I could feel that change. So how does a gun safety advocacy community get to people's hearts, not just their heads? That's one thing I would consider. And then secondly, I just try to think of it, I'm a national security person. I just remind people that when I was a child, I'm 47, when I was a child, the #1 killer of children was not gun violence, it was car accidents. Even a small car accident, a child would fly out of the front window, no car seats, no seat belts, no kind of regulatory regime, and children were paying the price for that. So what does a healthy society do when we identify the #1 killer of children? Shouldn't be political. We go after that, right? We do things. What did we do? We first passed laws on car seats at the federal level, at the state level. We then started to pass regulation for the car industry, right? You can't buy a car now without something dinging if you don't put it on your seatbelt. Then we did the cultural training, right? When I was in 3rd grade, I got a gold star every day if I wore my seatbelt into school. We trained ourselves as a society how to improve the situation. And now small car accidents are not the #1 killer of children. So I try to take it out of this political lens, get to people's hearts, and make the safety case, because all Americans obviously should care about their children. So thank you for having us today. Thank you for caring about this issue. I do think that this is one of the fundamental issues of our time. You are living in an era where, unfortunately, there will come a tipping point where so many people are personally affected by gun violence that we as a society decide we're not going to go on this way. So thank you for being a part of that. And I'm happy to hand it back to our hosts.
Thank you, Representative. I'm going to bring in your colleague, Representative Debbie Dingell. As a proud constituent, I'm happy to welcome you to our conversation. Representative Dingell, can you talk to us and reflect on also Representative Slotkin's comments about what we have to do to start moving this issue at the federal level?
So good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, Ryan. I love you in your new role. I've loved working with you on all of the issues we've worked on over the years. And it's great to be with Rep. Slotkin and Kelly Breen and my friends from Giffords, Everytown, and CAP. They're doing a lot of very important work, and to everybody that's here, that you're taking time out from your day to talk about it. This really matters. I guess Elissa has laid out what the policies are at the federal level. So I'm not going to repeat all of those bills. Some of them, especially the case that's at the Supreme Court, I led the amicus brief, and I'll talk about domestic violence in a minute. I'm going to talk about how this issue has evolved, the challenges that we're up against, and maybe talk about what steps we can take to tackle this urgent need, and maybe how do we build that grassroots moment. Because I do think some days I think we're going backwards. Some days I think we're going forwards, and I think it's a real challenge. I like Elissa, but I think in more ways than many, I have seen all sides of this issue. I know it better than most. I was married. Look, I'm not going to lie to any of you. I was married to a man that was on the NRA board. I don't think the New York Times totally portrayed the role that he played. And I slept with the man till the day he died, slept with the handgun under his pillow. I also lived with a man that shouldn't have had guns. I had to keep my father from killing my mother. I grabbed the gun. I know what it was like to hide in closets. More than one night, I thought we were going to die. I know all sides of this, and I know how I know responsible gun owner, and I know guns in the hands of those that shouldn't have them result in very bad consequences. So when I talk about, things that I think one of the ugliest times that I remember was when the gun bill was passed in 1994. We got the assault weapons ban. And to be perfectly frank, John Dingell voted for that bill. It was one of the hardest things that he ever did, probably didn't like it. And he had to have police protection for 6 months because people were so angry at him for passing that bill. And when it expired in 2004, there was an immediate and steep increase in mass shooting deaths. And quite frankly, they've been growing in years since. Studies have proven that an assault weapons ban reduces and prevents gun deaths. And I know University of Michigan is the sponsor of this, and they're here, and they've been doing incredible, incredible work. But we can't get it passed again because the issues become even more partisan. More, by the way, than it was in 1994, and that's saying a lot. More charged and more extreme than it's ever been. Polling shows that 70 to 90% of Americans support common sense gun reforms that'll save lives. But that broad support isn't being reflected in the Congress. And that's why it's so important what you're doing today, that we continue to advocate and fight for that change, so that to ensure that public sentiment gets translated into policy. You've seen it can make a difference. I mean, unfortunately, it took some horrific incidences to get passage in the state legislature. Also, I'm not going to be political, but I am. Elections have consequences. We had a legislature that was willing to stand up and take tough votes. And therefore, because of that, we've seen progress in reforms at the state level. Universal background checks, safe storage laws, extreme risk protection orders. You all don't know how many times I tried to figure out, how would you be able to keep a gun out of my father's hands? What would it take? I am one of the biggest supporters of red flags because I knew in a moment's notice that he could snap and that gun would be out. And then my mother bought a gun to protect herself. So it became another weapon in the house. And then my brother knew where the guns were. This is a very, very dangerous combination, and people don't want to talk about it, but we got to put a public face on it. It's one of the reasons that I do. And in the Congress, I have been especially focused on ensuring that survivors of domestic violence aren't forgotten in this discussion. As we talk about the gun violence, in this case at the Supreme Court, is very, very important. If someone, it protects due process. If someone has been convicted of domestic violence with a gun, they have a felony, then they wouldn't be able to have a gun. And you do not know how frightening it is to be a woman who knows that someone wants to harm you, wants to kill you, that you try to get protective orders, by the way. We just had a killing last summer in Saline of a woman who had gone in and gotten a protective order, but it was never served, and she got shot and killed in the parking lot. These threats are real. We want to keep our kids safe in schools, but we need to keep children and women and men safe in their homes from people as well. So I want to keep anybody from experiencing some of the trauma that we've seen in the schools or that my family did. I've introduced the legislation to close what's called the boyfriend loophole, to prevent dating partners convicted of domestic violence offense. What the Supreme Court case would do is would take back some of the protections we got in the Violence Against Women as well. So we can't go back, but we already have. The assault weapons ban expired. We got to keep making progress. We got a lot of bills we're trying to pass at the federal level, but we need your help. Many elected officials are just afraid of getting on the wrong side of the gun lobby. They have tremendous political power and a big voter base that's very passionate. The majority of Americans are on our side, and we need to make sure. I am going to be partisan now. We got to get the vote out. Elections have consequences. We got to make the noise. We got to hold people accountable. We got to make it public where they are. We got to keep organizing, and we can't stop until we keep many, many more safe. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Representative. I know you and Representative Slotkin both have to duck out a little early to govern our country. Before you leave, I just wanted to ask one first question for both of you. Here in Michigan at the state level, we just passed a very significant set of legislation, and it was years that legislators like Senator Bayer, Representative Carter had prepared the ground for that legislation, waiting for that moment where we would have a window where we could pass this common sense reform that's going to save lives. So, obviously things are at a standstill in Congress right now due to composition of who's in charge of the House. And as Representative Slotkin mentioned, the filibuster in the Senate. But what work should we be doing now and preparing for when we do have a legislative window, when the politics in Washington change and we need to seize that moment? What would you like to see queued up and ready to go? I'll ask Representative Dingell first, and then Representative Slotkin.
Well, I'm going to start with something right now, which is in Michigan, we have a Senate seat that's up. And you need to pay attention to that Senate seat, to be perfectly frank. She can't say it, I will. Because we already can't, we have a majority in the Senate, but we can't get the bills through the Senate because of the filibuster. And that's a problem. I mean, elections do have consequences. But everybody knows people in other states. We need to really bring home to people that elections do have consequences. And we need to find a way. I actually, before my husband died, I had this is probably the issue that we disagreed on the most. And I have been very vocal on many of these subjects. But he even said to me, times have changed. And I think there are a lot of gun owners who do know that times have changed. And we need to, there's a very loud minority. Look, when the men were at the state capitol with assault weapons, I was on Andrea Mitchell and said they don't belong at the state capitol with assault weapons. And there were men outside my house with assault weapons that night. You got to not be afraid. There are too many people that they think their voice doesn't matter. They get intimidated. We have to become the vocal majority. We can't be the silent majority. And we really have to say to people, elections have consequences. And by the way, it's going to matter at the presidential level as well.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, before I started this work, I had to have a conversation with my wife. I had to tell her I'm going to be on TV talking about the need to regulate firearms differently in this country. And is that something you're comfortable with our family's name being on? Because we have kids. And what my wife said to me was, we cannot be held hostage. We're not going to let our advocacy or our democracy be held at gunpoint by these people. And that's something I hear from legislators a lot, is that they are threatened and some are scared. And so you're right, we have to overcome that fear that's intentionally being created. I'm going to hand things over to Representative Slotkin. When we have a window, what should we be preparing to try and move in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, look, I come from the national security world. So having an actual strategic plan that you've thought through, so it's not kind of a free for all when hopefully leadership changes and we can actually legislate, is really important. That means corralling the many voices in the community to make sure we understand priority number 1, 2, 3, and why they are priorities. I think everybody wants their kind of piece into this. issue, but at a certain point, both advocates and researchers, people who are grassroots supporters, need to coalesce around kind of 3 top priorities and have that ready to go, frankly, public and available, and advocating with your representatives on what the 3 priorities are. I would also say that for many of the grassroots supporters, again, getting back to this idea of how do you get to people's hearts, right? It's probably not a rally. It's probably not, an amazing website with policy positions. One of the things that I felt really strongly with the MSU shooting, actually the students were holding a rally. I went to it and they said, stand up if you have done an active shooter drill when you were in school. And unsurprisingly, every single student and young person there had all done one, and none of us who were of a certain age had ever done it. And so we're having conversations with our superintendents in my district about, how do you maybe invite parents in a parent-teacher night and have them walk through what an active shooter drill feels like for their children. Have them feel like, I'm walking in my 8-year-old shoes when they're shoved to a corner of the classroom and told to run, hide, and fight. I want to impact their hearts. And a lot of our parents have not gone through what their kids are now going through. So thinking through some of those. And then I just have to be honest, just as someone who is out and about a lot, I have found, maybe unsurprisingly, that women are a really important change factor in our state on so many issues, but on this issue, like a lot. And I can't tell you, when we reopened MSU and we had kind of a big welcome back fair, and I was volunteering at the fair, and I was volunteering at like a table, handing out snacks and water and all that stuff with a bunch of women. They identified themselves, self-identified as, Republican women. They all come from gun owning families. A couple of them had their own concealed carry permits. And they were like, that's it. Like, I'm not doing this anymore. I want the right to defend myself, but I can't have my child attacked in school. So I think thinking through, how do we get out of a bubble of talking just to ourselves and people who already believe in these issues, and do that hard work of going to folks who might not be receptive at first, but who know that we shouldn't be a country where children are attacked in their communities and their schools. So I would say the grassroots work of persuading people, of getting to people's hearts, thinking through creative ideas of how to do that, like inviting people in for an active shooter drill. And then having a concrete plan that every gun safety organization, they're at the table and helping to create. So the minute there's a window, there's a plan of 2 or 3 things, not 100 things, 2 or 3 key things that are going to make a difference. So that's what I recommend.
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative. I will second that motion that women, and particularly moms demand action, are just really key to this whole movement. As a father, I remember when my son described to me his first lockdown drill. And the school didn't tell him why he was doing it. So it was up to me to explain to him that he had to practice hiding from a bad man with a gun in kindergarten. And parents don't understand. So I love that idea of getting more parents to understand what their own children are experiencing day to day. Sean, I'm going to bring Sean from Giffords into the conversation. He is the man I call when I want to know what are the 3 things we're going to advocate for. So that's a great transition to what should our agenda be.
Great. Well, first and foremost, thank you to our federal partners. I mean, obviously, this is an ever-going struggle. And as Representative Slotkin stated, it's great that states like Michigan are passing these bills, but we need our Congress to do the same, because obviously it's going to be a long time before states like Wyoming and Louisiana are passing legislation like Michigan. So first and foremost, thank you to you both, and then thank you to End Gun Violence Michigan, to Johns Hopkins, Everytown, Brady. I don't think any of this would have happened if we hadn't all worked together in concert. And it was really incredible to see everyone work together in lockstep to pass the legislation that we saw in 2023. background checks, safe storage, red flag laws, domestic violence. Right before they adjourned, the House passed banning guns and polls, and there was a sorry, I want to make sure I get the language right. There was a HB 4606 Representative Farhat's bill, which would establish a public safety trust fund, and within that there was $6 million around that. That would make Michigan the second state in the entire country that would codify community violence intervention. So there's a lot that Michigan did in 2023, and I think there's a lot more that we can do. And it's great that this conversation is happening now so we can know what to expect next year and in years ongoing. So there's a lot for us to cover. Really, I'm just going to talk about a couple things before passing the baton over to my other federal partners. First and foremost, CVI, community violence intervention, is something that Giffords really cares deeply about and strives to educate people on across the country. So as we heard in the keynote discussion, there was a question about gun violence in inner cities and how these shootings affect Black and brown communities, and how the conversation around gun violence often focuses on school shootings and mass shootings that often disproportionately affect people in the suburbs. And the thing is, we use these opportunities as a way to honor tragedy with action and to pass these bills. But in doing so, we also need to continue the conversation around community violence intervention. So when we talk about that, in Michigan, 85% of more than the 800 homicides each year are committed with a gun. Nearly 80% of homicide victims in Michigan are either Black or Latino. So because of this, and with our partnership in the governor's office and with the legislature, CVI investment in Michigan is at a historic high. 2023 included more than $10 million in investment in CVI, including grants and the creation of the Office of Community Violence Intervention Services to support coordinated community violence prevention efforts and provide annual grants to community violence prevention partners. The office is located in the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And this year in 2024, we've seen a proposal for $800,000 for ongoing support for that office. We, of course, would like to see more, and that's a struggle that we always have to keep pushing our legislative partners on, and our partners in the governor's office, for more money for these community violence intervention services. And as I had mentioned before, with Representative Farhat's HB 4606, it passed the House at the end of 2023. There's more work that needs to be done on that between the House and the Senate, but this essentially would amend the Michigan Trust Fund Act to establish the Public Safety and Violence Prevention Fund within the Department of Treasury. And that bill contains, like I said, that around $6 to $7 million every single year for community violence intervention. It's incredibly important that we advocate for that, and we uplift the work of our partners like Force Detroit to ensure that that funding can go to our community partners. I'm going to touch on a couple other things that I know some other people may touch upon, but we've got a limited amount of time left. So raise the age. Laws imposing minimum age requirements for the possession and purchase of firearms are intended to decrease access to firearms by young people, and correspondingly to decrease the number of suicides, homicides, and unintentional shootings. A couple key stats here that give us strength to this argument. People ages 18 to 20 are responsible for a disproportionate share of school shootings, public mass shootings, and gun homicides overall. In fact, 18 to 20-year-olds comprise just 4% of the population, but account for 17% of known gun homicide offenders. Data also suggests that young people disproportionately commit gun homicides. For example, 18 to 20-year-olds comprise just 4%, like I said, but account for 17% of known homicide offenders. Sorry, excuse me. If the handgun is purchased in Michigan right now, if a handgun is purchased from a federally licensed dealer, the applicant must be age 21 or older. If it's a private sale, the buyer only has to be 18. So we'd like to kind of close that loophole and get Michigan in line with a state like, for instance, Florida. In Florida, you have to be 21 years of age to buy a firearm or a long gun. We'd like Michigan to match what Florida has done. Other thing I just want to quickly touch upon are ghost guns. Many people here know what ghost guns are, but many people in the public do not. Ghost guns are crime guns. They are guns that you can purchase in separate pieces, put together in your home, and what you have is an unserialized weapon that cannot be traced back to the person if that gun is found at the scene of a crime. All we're trying to do is make sure that these guns are serialized. The one of the things that we always talk about is working with the legislature to ensure that they're passing good policy that is also good politics. This is good politics. The number one message that popped the most in polls in 2022 was giving law enforcement the tools necessary to crack down on illegal gun trafficking. Passing ghost guns does that. So we very much hope to see the legislature take up ghost guns this year and years in the future, to work with our federal partners at the DOJ to ensure that people aren't having easy access to these crime guns. All right, Ryan, I'll pass the baton.
Thanks so much, Sean. I'm going to bring in Nick Wilson from the Center on American Progress, who's one of our nation's leading progressive think tanks.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Let me start by putting Michigan into context of some recent gun violence trends, and then I'll drill down into what's next for advocates and leaders in the state. We're at this really interesting inflection point where, following several years of an alarming spike nationally in violent crime during the pandemic, last year we saw the largest one-year decline in murder rates in modern US history. But this remarkable drop hasn't been felt evenly across the country, and states with the weakest gun laws have seen the least amount of progress. We actually have research coming out tomorrow morning analyzing last year's gun violence archive data and combining it with the scorecard that our partners at Giffords do every year to show that firearm homicides actually fell much faster in states with the strongest gun laws, while states with the weakest gun laws saw marginal improvements to public safety, if any. Of the 300 largest US cities, those in states with the strongest gun laws experienced a 19% fewer gun homicides compared to the previous year, while states with the weakest gun laws only saw 5% fewer gun homicides. So we're really seeing kind of a divergence of two Americas, where states like Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Ohio, they passed these permitless carry laws, meaning that in the majority of US states, almost anyone can carry a concealed handgun without a permit in public. On this other side of America, states that already have some decent or foundational gun laws are continuing to bolster this public health approach. Last year, Illinois passed an assault weapon ban. New York increased access to victim compensation and services for gun violence survivors, which is one of the next big frontiers, I think, for the movement. California, with the help of Giffords, levied a tax on firearms and ammunition sales to fund CVI programs. And states like Delaware, Hawaii, and my state of Maryland prohibited firearms at polling places to help protect democracy. And what's really learned is elections matter. Michigan is really what we point to a lot, as well as Minnesota, that you could by signing key gun laws into law, after voters, elected these gun safety majorities, we can really see the impact. And violence in Michigan was already trending down when some of these passed. But I think we could say that, Michigan saw a 21% reduction statewide in gun homicides, but it's still far too high. And we need to take this momentum and take it into the next year. I mean, it's great to look at Detroit. Out of the 30 most populous US cities, Detroit had the largest year-over-year reduction. It fell 37%. Detroit is now probably no longer in the top 6 for the highest murder rates for big cities for the first time since 1979. So now it's time to build on what we call these foundational gun laws that are passed and really think about all the different types of gun violence. We talked about earlier, our congressional representatives talked about suicide and domestic violence. And, so last year, CAP released a product with a bunch of different things that Michigan can do, whether it's requiring state licensing and security measures so that we can reduce gun thefts from licensed dealers, banning the open and concealed carry of guns on government grounds, better implementing and expanding firearm relinquishment protocols for domestic violence survivors. Now that we have an ERPO law, how do we do equitable implementation? But we need to dig deeper. 2 more things I wanted to highlight. One is magazine limits. This is one tool that can help prevent an active shooter from turning into a mass shooter. We usually use those terms interchangeable, but an active shooter only becomes a mass shooter when they're able to shoot 4 people, not including themselves. But when they're reloading, because there's a magazine of only, say, 10 bullets, that's when it's an opportunity to engage and tackle the shooter, which is actually what happened at the Gabby Giffords shooting, where during reload, there was a chance for people to intervene and stop the shooter. Waiting periods was something that was really pushed for a while as a cooling off period for someone that wants to commit a homicide. but we've actually found in the research that its biggest impact was on preventing firearm suicides. So these are just a few things that we really want to keep focusing on. There's still a lot of work to be done on community-based violence intervention programs. A lot of ARPA money and some federal money has really been able to help these programs grow, but there's going to be a fiscal cliff coming. So we've actually partnered with Giffords on a series of storytelling videos, because we keep writing reports and they're just not breaking through. It's still a new term. It's not a new concept, but it's really getting into the mainstream. And if we want people to fund it, we really need to reach people where they are. And so I'll share a link to where some of the videos highlighting frontline workers has really been impactful on trying to get more federal, state, and local funding. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Nick. We really appreciate your support. I'm going to bring in State Representative Kelly Breen, who represents my old hometown of Novi, Go Wildcats. And I first want to thank you for all the incredible leadership that you showed this past year. So many of this incredible new laws that we have in our state passed through your committee, and you shepherded them during just a time when I know it seemed like half of the laws in the state of Michigan were also going through your committee. So I know you're personally committed to this issue, and you and your staff burn the midnight oil to make the difference. Can you talk to us about what might be on deck for this year, what the folks in the Michigan legislature are considering, and what you'd like to see happen as next steps?
Sure. And just a bit of background, I want to thank our federal partners, especially Rep. Slotkin, who has firsthand knowledge of how to use firearms and represents Oxford and MSU. I live in Oakland County, same as where Oxford is. I'm a proud Michigan State alum. And when it comes to guns, we all know in Michigan somebody who has guns. And we all know somebody who should not have guns. We heard Rep. Dingell talk about her personal stories, and I think we should note that her husband, the former Dean of the House, we owe him a debt of gratitude because he was a reasonable and responsible firearm owner. And like John Gold from Giffords, also responsible firearm owner who has done an incredible job with his advocacy here. Coming into this session that we're halfway through now, gun legislation was a priority, but it quickly moved to the forefront. And as you mentioned, we did, I'm chair of judiciary. We did firearm legislation at the same time we were codifying reproductive freedom, and the same time we were codifying LGBTQ rights with Elliot Larson. It was a lot. And ERPO and Red Flag came shortly thereafter, and that took some time because we really, really struggled to get it right. And when we got majority in the House, before this even started, I asked Speaker Tate to, one, let me keep my parking spot under the hob because I'm a working mom and I'm always running behind. And two, I wanted to usher through firearm legislation through judiciary. And we were able to do that. And we worked very hard to find a balance between the Second Amendment and due process, saving lives, protecting others, but also not running afoul of the Supreme Court and Bruin. We had Republican congressmen testify in favor of these bills. I worked specifically with Sean at Giffords. I worked with Nicole Hockley, who lost her son Dylan at Sandy Hook, and Matt Schechter, who lost his son Alex at Parkland, and parents from Oxford. We worked with University of Michigan, John Hopkins, judges, Senator McMorrow and Chang, and gun violence, of course, and the Brady campaign. And to everybody watching this, know that before, a lot of people who were elected before me, like senators, like Senator Bayer and Representative Brenda Carter, they've been advocating, but I started where a lot of you are now as an advocate, fiercely advocating for my kids. Because as I watched Sandy Hook unfold, and my daughter was only 2 years old at the time, I thought, I am not going to let her grow up in a world like this. So what is next? What can we do? We have to look at the political realities. That is absolutely true. We currently, we heard Rep. Slotkin talk a lot about the political realities of the federal level, and we need to look at the political reality of where we are in Michigan. And in the House, we are 54-54, at least until April. And then we have the slimmest of majorities. And this is hard. It's very wearing on our families. Everybody who has worked on this legislation, I think, has gotten a threat of some sort. It's not fun getting that call from the FBI. And we all have to power through it. And it's not fun. So we all want a lot of things, but again, we have to accept the political reality. And there are things that we can do that I think are going to help save lives. We've got accidents, we've got suicides, and we have homicides. And there are different ways to address each and every one of these. And some of these can be bipartisan. We talk about enforcing laws on the books. I've had sheriffs and prosecutors come to me about federal laws that aren't at the state level. And there are things that we can do for people who are already a prohibited purchaser, make it a state felony and require immediate notification to law enforcement. If somebody who fails a background check, we can do everything we can to make sure that law enforcement is immediately notified and that they don't get that gun. That's one thing. We need to hold the gun industry accountable. Accountability is a big thing. We can talk about the special immunity provided to the gun industry and what we could do to mitigate that to hold them responsible. There are some holes currently in our laws, the boyfriend loophole. That's another thing that we would like to address. There are people who have Alzheimer's and they still have firearm access. We could take the process that we are enacting for red flag laws and see if we can use the same process to make sure that people who shouldn't have guns, like people who might have dementia, that they have a safe way to relinquish those firearms. And those could be possibly some areas where we get Republican support. Ghost guns, that is definitely on the table. It's something to address. I would like to say there's something that we're not talking about enough, and that is reducing violence overall. And there are ways to reduce gun violence without even necessarily talking about guns. To highlight that, I'd look at the Sandy Hook Promise, where they have programs that they use in schools to help mitigate violence. If there's one thing I've learned, I'm also on the school safety task force, is that the key to mitigating violence in schools is social emotional learning. And that helps kids understand themselves, those big feelings, and know what problems to look for in their peers. And there are ways to address this, everything from making sure kids have resources to recess, making sure that their bellies are full, like we have done now with the free breakfast and lunch, making sure that we have multi-tiered systems of support for kids. So that's something that I would like to see us talking about more, is reducing violence overall, especially in the areas of school safety, to make sure that our kids have everything they need to stay safe. And I do believe that we will be seeing a lot of those bills come up in coming probably within the next couple months. We should be seeing some of that action with school safety coming through in the Michigan legislature.
Well, that is great to hear, and thank you for giving that preview of what we might see in the next year. I'm going to bring in Monisha Henley from Everytown for Gun Safety. Monisha, can you talk about the various different frames we can use to think about gun safety and how we can think about it maybe differently going forward?
Sure. I think that's something that's really important to acknowledge in listening to this conversation and thinking specifically about Michigan, is how a lot of times the focus can feel like it's about the gun owner. And I think it's really important to zoom out and actually focus on the gun industry. And you heard that part of the priorities this legislative session in Michigan is going to be holding the gun industry accountable. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is so important. The gun industry is one of the few industries in the country that has a blanket immunity and essentially has not had any regulation since the 1960s. And as a result of these federal statutes, they've been protected from civil litigation. And folks who are familiar with advocacy and how change really happens and occurs in this country, we know a big part of that has happened as a result of civil litigation. And an example is what Representative Slotkin gave to us earlier today, is when the leading cause of death for children and teens was car accidents. What happened? We saw civil litigation go into place, and as a result, airbags, seat belts, and tire updates happened in the auto industry. We saw the same thing happen with tobacco products. We saw the same thing happen with opioids. And now it's really important for us to put policies in place to really hold the gun industry accountable. This is a policy we've had an opportunity to work on for the last couple of years. And sometimes it can feel like, what is this big ghost that we're saying as the gun industry? So I want to humanize this for a little bit and share something with you all that I heard from a state senator in New York say when he was working on this. He said, I'm tired. I'm tired of having to hold a grieving mother, of having to get on another phone call about violence in my community and having to light one more candle for those lost. I think that's a sentiment that we can all relate to. We are so tired of losing lives to the gun violence. And specifically, I think we should all be really tired of seeing the gun industry profit over those lives. So that's why I'm really excited for us to work with everybody on this call, with the legislature, at the federal level and at the state level on really making sure we're putting this type of policy in place. I also want to acknowledge another piece of this, which is assault weapons. We heard Representative Dingell talk about the assault weapons ban, which we know was effective in the 90s. And I think that is a huge priority for Congress and its federal partners to take up again. You're not alone in this fight. Michigan is definitely leading the way, but there are other states that are joining on holding the industry accountable this session, including places like Maryland and New Mexico and Illinois. And I think that's a new framework and a new way for us to view how we can address this important issue.
Thank you for that framing, Monisha. I think it's sometimes hard to think about an issue as big as gun violence because it feels a bit like the weather, right? It just kind of happens and there's no one responsible for it. But there have been big changes in our laws, big changes in our culture that people are making money from. Are you able to talk a little bit about how the gun industry has driven some of those changes over time?
Sure. A prime example of that is assault weapons. You saw, as I mentioned, in the 1990s, we saw a decrease in homicides when there was an assault weapons ban. Then we saw when that expired, that started to increase. Then you saw states leading the way, as they do things like in California, Massachusetts, and Hawaii, where they created an assault weapons ban, which was known oftentimes now as a features test. So saying that these certain features are not allowed to, these certain features are what is included in assault weapons. What did the industry do? They created a new firearm. They basically said, what is the features? And now we're going to create something new. If I was able to share my screen, I would show you some of those visuals of what these featureless assault weapons look like. They're very funny looking, but they still count as an assault weapon. And that's also why we're really excited to see a new approach to this type of policy, which Senator Martin Heinrich just introduced, known as Go Safe, which actually addresses the mechanism, gas operation of an assault weapon, and not just the features. But this just shows how the gun industry has continued to take advantage of looking at these policies, playing a little bit of head, being immune from civil litigation, and then adjusting to continue to keep weapons of war essentially in our communities.
Thanks, Monisha. I'm going to turn a little bit to an issue that we've been dealing with in Michigan that addresses a topic I've heard brought up a number of times, which is ghost guns. Maybe you saw the New York Times story where it turns out the state police were taking guns that had been turned in during buybacks or seized at crime scenes, and the company that had been contracted to destroy those guns was actually selling the pieces of the gun, not the firearm or receiver, onto the open market. And those pieces of those guns weren't serialized, so they could be used in ghost gun cuts. We're very happy that the administration and the state police have announced that they won't be doing that anymore. They'll be sending those pieces of firearms to a scrapyard where they will be chopped up into little bits. But I was wondering if we could address one potential legislation to address this source of how parts are fueling the ghost gun market. But then also, what are the ways we can deal with ghost guns in addition to serialization? What are the things we have to do to shut down that market?
I'll hop in. I do know that Senator McMorrow has been running point on that, a lot of the issues that were stemming from that New York Times article. And we have been looking at different options to, for those gun buybacks. I think it's important to note that while the gun buybacks are helpful, they are helpful, but the impact that they have on reducing gun violence overall, we have not been able to quite measure its effectiveness. A lot of the times it's people who might just have a firearm that has been given to them in a will, or they just wound up with it by accident and they're not actively looking to get rid of it for reasons that, such as they have somebody who is off their medication, or they have somebody who has the potential for violence. They just don't know what to do with this firearm. And the people that have the firearms aren't themselves a threat. But there was talk about the state of Michigan possibly purchasing its own gun crusher. I, as far as whether or not there was an official announcement, I may have missed something. And is using the scrapyard, whether that's going to be a permanent ongoing solution, I can't speak to that. But as far as ghost guns, we've looked at different ways that we can possibly get rid of them here at the state level. And if there's one thing that's very clear, we can't lock down the internet. We just can't do it, especially at the state level. I know that federal legislation has been introduced, but we also know the political reality of that. As far as there's a guy not far from me, he 3D printed a rocket launcher, for crying out loud. Whether or not it'll work, I don't know. But we have people that are also able to 3D print parts, even if they don't have every single part of the gun available. So that is an issue. So we do have some draft legislation that we are still working on. We're running it through all the people, and we're hoping to get something done with ghost guns, because these go right to the core of what even we hear folks who are pro Second Amendment talk about. You really want to target the bad people with the guns, and ghost guns those are coming in exponentially within every crime that has been investigated. So there's definitely a higher proliferation of ghost guns out there being used in crimes. And I think that's where we can possibly get some bipartisan support.
So just real quick on the gun buyback piece, I know that Representative Brayback has drafted some legislation that would just essentially demand that any guns bought by the state would have to be destroyed. The issue therein, though, is that comes with appropriations amendment of about $1 million every single year. And then we sort of get into this conversation of, do we want to get in the business of the gun buyback industry? It's a tough conversation, because what we don't want to do is having our state police essentially being partners in the ghost gun industry and selling off pieces of weapons. That is not what we want. We do want these weapons to be destroyed. So that's a conversation we're continuing to have. We do want to make sure that guns are destroyed and not sold back on the market. And all of us, Everytown, Brady, and Giffords are working with Representative Breen and Senator McMorrow on ghost guns. It is definitely a high atop the priority list for us to make sure that states that do have Democratic majorities can act on this. So we will continue to be a resource and hope that Michigan can join. However, as Representative Breen said, as with most gun laws, it's very easy for someone in Michigan to drive across over to Indiana if they really want a weapon. So it's why it's so important that we have our federal partners continue to work on this.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sean. Thank you, Representative. I think my last set of questions will be about protecting democracy. The House passed a set of bills at the end of last year banning firearms at polling places. I attended the State of the State last week and was very glad to see metal detectors at the Capitol, which had not been there before. Representative Breen, if you can talk about what you're looking at to protect democracy in this time of real instability, where we're seeing extremists use the threat of violence more and more. Then I'd like to bring in our other partners to talk about other model legislation in other places that we could look towards.
So those bills went through actually our elections committee. Representative Cerniglu has done an amazing job along those lines to make sure that our election workers are protected. That is absolutely a priority for everyone in our caucus. I know it's a priority for the governor and the secretary of state and the attorney general as well. And I do have a bill myself to ban firearms at the Capitol. Right now, the Capitol Commission has just said, working with the speaker, we're not going to let firearms in there. That can change with the next legislature easily. So that is something that we can codify. We have now these detectors at not just at the Capitol, but I know for sure we have them in the House office building. What's next after that, I'm not sure. I know that one of the complaints is there's already laws against intimidating election workers. Sure, but then you get into, what does intimidate mean? What does to brandish a weapon mean? And not everybody has the same definition. I think a big component of that is going to be education and implementation of those laws, same as the red flag laws, education and implementation. And we are still waiting a lot of guidance on the red flag laws from the Supreme Court and the governor's office, as well as our partners in law enforcement. So I wish I could give you more information on it, but I will say that their implementation is getting worked on, and hopefully we will have some guidance on that. And then comes the education component, because we need election workers. We need election workers. And a lot of people don't want to do it anymore. We just had a threat here in Oakland County against one of our directors. Somebody didn't like what he was seeing in a recount and threatened to kill him. It's horrible. Unfortunately, law enforcement is taking these threats seriously, but the fact that we're having the threats in the first place is a big problem.
Thank you, Representative. Sean, Nick, Monisha, what else could we be looking at to protect our democracy?
No, I think we've seen a number of bills that are being worked on, all of our organizations, and complete with work from the Joyce Foundation. We're working hard to ensure that people feel safe going to go vote. Where that runs into certain problems, though, is getting into sensitive areas piece of this whole conversation, because there are some conversations about, is a drop-off ballot box, is that a voting location? And then you run into some issues if someone happens to have a weapon on them in that area where a ballot drop-off box is. We're continuing to work on that and figure out that language. I mean, all of our organizations work together to ensure that every bill that is written can withstand a challenge in the courts. However, this is a very interesting Supreme Court to work with. We never know what they're going to do. Just like, the Attorney General mentioned earlier with Rahimi, we're still sort of like reading the tea leaves. Does this mean that a violent felon will be able to get a weapon? Based upon their arguments, maybe not. I think we might be safe there, but will ERPO be safe in the future? Will these guns and democracy bills be safe in the future? We don't really know, but we're doing the best we can to ensure that people feel safe in public buildings when they go vote, when they serve on boards and commissions. And a lot of this is still new. We didn't have these conversations about public officials being threatened 10 years ago. A lot of this is new. And as Representative Breen said, and I'm sure Monisha could speak to this as well, every single gun safety champion across the country and states has received death threats. It is now a part of the job, a job that doesn't pay near enough, that takes away too much time from a person, and it causes a lot of mental distress and fatigue. And it's a really tough problem for legislators to have to, bear this burden of being a good representative, but also then getting these death threats. So we're all working to figure out the problem, but I am heartened to see the type of progress across the states that we have seen over the last couple of years.
Thanks, Sean. Go ahead, Monisha.
I will just add on just one little piece, which is, when we saw the January 6th insurrection, something that I reflected on is the fact that we actually had seen some of these demonstrations play out in states, especially in a place like Michigan. And so if we've been paying attention to what's happening in Michigan and Kentucky and some other states, we maybe wouldn't have been still surprised by what happened on January 6th. And the piece that is a common thread here is when extremists have firearms, they are deadly. And that we have to continue to protect places where democracy happens, which is why we saw movements of keeping firearms out of state capitals, including in places like in the Deep South, like in Tennessee and other places. And also we need to make sure that they're not happening at polling places, they're not happening in playgrounds, and acknowledging, which has been mentioned on this in this conversation, is like in a post-Bruin world, what does a sensitive place mean? So this is something that we continue to work on, that we continue to work with our partners at Giffords, Brady, and CAP to really drill into and make sure that we're preparing our legislative friends and champions with what they need to address these policies. But I think right now, guns in polling places is just such a huge one. And I'm really proud to work with the folks in Michigan to make sure that one gets across the finish line.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a great place to close our conversation. I'd like to thank our federal representatives, Elissa Slotkin and Debbie Dingell, for participating today in their advocacy. State Representative Breen, thank you for your leadership and for joining our conversation. And to our experts, Sean, Nick, Monisha, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us today and as part of our advocacy efforts. I'd just like to remind everybody that the conference is just the start of the conversation. So you can volunteer with a local organization, Giffords, Moms Demand Action, Students Demand Action, End Gun Violence Michigan, and we'll be able to help you take action in your own community. So sign up in the links that have been in the chat. The next session will start at 12:30. So I look forward to seeing everyone in some really important conversations, including with faith leaders and law enforcement. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great afternoon.